Welcome to Question Time. And with me here at the headquarters of the London Scottish Regiment in London, the Defence Secretary, Liam Fox, Labour's former Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, Richard Perle, at the heart of defence planning under President Bush, a staunch advocate of ousting Saddam Hussein, Greer, playwright born in Chicago who now lives in the United Kingdom, and the author and broadcaster Tariq who believes the United States used 9/11 to promote its imperialist ambitions. Thank you very much. Well, let's have our first question. It's from Kieran Falconer, please. Kieran Falconer.
What should America have done after 9/11?
What should America have done after 9/11? Liam Fox.
It should have really responded, I think, in much the way it did in terms of the al-Qaeda threat coming from Afghanistan. I think it's quite difficult, even 10 years on, to remember the shock that 9/11 caused. I was actually in New York just a few days later, and I can remember very vividly how that felt, and the shock that Americans felt that an attack had happened on their own soil. And then, of course, there was the issue that the Taliban government in Kabul would not hand over those that were responsible for the planning and execution of the 9/11 attack. And then I think what happened after that was inevitable, that the international community, as they did, would decide to overthrow the government in Kabul and to ensure that it did not become again a breeding ground for that sort of terrorist attack.
And Iraq was inevitable too?
No, I think Iraq was different. I think that the arguments about Afghanistan were much more clear-cut. It was, I think, the reason that you ended up with 49 countries taking part in ISAF, which we have in Afghanistan at the present time, while there was much more dispute over who should take part in the Iraq conflict.
Greer, what should America have done?
I made a film for the BBC about 2 months after 9/11. We went back to my hometown, Chicago, and we went to New York City, so I live not far from Ground Zero. At that time, the people I spoke to were, of course, understandably upset, angry. A lot of people wanted revenge. But the majority of people really wanted to understand what the United States was in the world. They didn't understand what the United States could represent or be to people in the world, that this kind of thing could have happened. So this group of people that I spoke to were people who wanted to ask questions. They weren't thinking about attacks. They weren't thinking about going after anybody. They just wanted to understand.
But that is a reaction you got in Chicago. But what do you think the American government should have done? What it did or something different?
The American government, absolutely, the American government should have actually dealt with this in a way, as a homicide, as far as I'm concerned, first of all. The problem of New York, for instance, New York, I don't even think got an investigation about this for a long, long time. I think there should have been a lot more deliberation than there was. And it didn't happen.
Okay. Richard Perle, was it inevitable America acted as it did?
Yes, and I think we did pretty much what needed to be done in the immediate aftermath. We asked the Taliban government to turn bin Laden over. They refused. We waited a full 30 days before taking any military action. Then we worked with the Northern Alliance, which was the anti-Taliban group, and the Taliban were quickly dispatched. The Taliban regime had become a haven for Osama bin Laden and other terrorists. They had sanctuary, they had shelter, they had facilities with which to organize and recruit. And one result of that was 3,000 people killed in New York, including more Britons than died on 9/11 in the terror attack here. So I think what we did was what needed to be done.
Okay. Tariq.
In my opinion, and I argued this at the time, what took place was a crime carried out by a group of terrorists, and that what the United States should have done was to have searched and found these terrorists and tried them in an open court of law, as happens when other terrorists carry out attack on other countries, not forgetting the IRA attacks on Britain. The British government, not being a large imperial country, did not go and bomb places in the Irish Republic where the IRA often found refuge, leave alone Belfast. So I think that way of handling it would have been better. Instead, what we've got is a 10-year-long war. And the group of people you were searching left that country 2 weeks before American troops even arrived in Afghanistan and fled, as was expected.
If this was a crime, if this was a homicide, what does going into Iraq have to do with catching the killer?
David Miliband.
Well, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. I think that 9/11 was a day of shock, but also of incredible international unity. And I'd like to have seen the American government lead a drive in 3 areas. First of all, I think there was a possibility to rally a new kind of coalition between the West and the Muslim world. Secondly, I think there needed to be a regional solution in South Asia, because anyone who knows anything about Afghanistan knows that its problems can't be separated from those of Pakistan. And thirdly, and I think really importantly, it needed to dedicate itself to use that opportunity to build the kind of rules-based international order that is the only hope in the modern world. One other thing, David, which I think is really important and underlies a lot of this. The words war on terror should never have been uttered. That was a terrible setback for the kind of unity we needed.
Why?
Because they unified a series of disparate grievances under Osama bin Laden's banner. It glorified the people who did 9/11 as warriors, and it allowed people to argue that it was the West versus the Muslim world, and that's why it was very dangerous.
The woman up there.
I don't understand how it can be said that the best way to deal with violence is to enforce greater violence. I mean, that is not a constructive way to deal with terrorism.
Yes.
Can I go back to my homicide point, because I use that word, and I'm talking about homicide in the early days. My brother, who was in the service at the time, on the day of 9/11, thought a homicide had been committed, actually in revenge for the execution of Tim McVeigh 3 months before this had happened. People had all kinds of theories, and they thought homicide at first, not war, and that was changed.
Okay. Richard Perle, David Miliband said Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Is that your view too?
Yes.
Iraq would have happened without 9/11?
No, Iraq would not have happened under a variety of circumstances. 9/11 made American officials responsible for the safety of our citizens acutely conscious of the danger that another attack with weapons of mass destruction could dwarf 9/11 in terms of the casualties. And so immediately following 9/11, they did what I think was a logical thing to do. They made up a list of all the places where weapons of mass destruction might be obtained. And Iraq, of course, was on that list. It turns out that the intelligence was wrong. We know that now. But at the time, if you were the president and you asked yourself, what can I do to prevent an attack with weapons of mass destruction, you would have gone after the places where weapons of mass destruction could be found. And as it happens, Saddam Hussein was in violation of so many United Nations resolutions. Someone's talking, well, in fact, David, you were talking about a rule-based system. How many resolutions did the UN pass condemning Saddam Hussein? So that's your rule-based system.
Okay,
Tariq, do you want to answer this point?
Well, I think that it is quite staggering that in this day and age someone can still bring up weapons of mass destruction.
Sorry, but he was saying at the time, not now.
No, but even
what's
at the
happened now
time,
is obvious, but at the
David,
time...
even at the time, there were many people within the American intelligence agencies arguing that there were no weapons of mass destruction. In the British intelligence, likewise. People were arguing there were no weapons of mass destruction, and they were told to find the evidence so that this war could be fought. And it was a criminal war, a breach of sovereignty. Up to 1 million people have died. This Iraqi government says there are 5 million orphans, and no one cares. We talk about casualties, but we don't care about the number of Iraqis who have died.
Can I be on top? A criminal war is what Tariq Ali says.
To go back to the specific point about violence, and of course it would be nice if we could resolve any conflicts in the world by conversation, but I'm afraid that there are elements of violent fanaticism out there in the world that we would rather were not there, but they are, and they have to be dealt with. That's unfortunate, but it's true. But I think that when you opened, David, you mentioned the point about that was the beginning of a 10-year process. And I think we get to the end of this 10 years, and at the beginning, it was being portrayed in parts of the Muslim world that the legitimate aspirations of many of the world's Muslims would be achieved through violence and jihad, and we've got to the end of the decade when we see that the legitimate aspirations are actually achieved in Tahrir Square, not at Ground Zero.
Was it a criminal war, as Tariq Ali says?
In Afghanistan, no, of course not.
In Afghanistan and in Iraq.
No, I think that in Afghanistan it was a very clear and legal response to what happened on 9/11. Article 5 of NATO, for example, was invoked because the United States had been attacked. And I think that in Iraq, we have to remember that at the time, as Tony Blair had said in the House of Commons, and I remember watching with great interest in the House that night, that it wasn't just that there were accusations of weapons of mass destruction, but Saddam Hussein had refused to allow international inspectors in and had repeatedly refused to allow that to happen. And there were suspicions that that might happen. Now, it's turned out not to be correct, and a lot of people will feel angry and disappointed about that, but that's how it seemed at the time.
Okay. The man in the second row there, yes.
Irregardless of the question of weapons of mass destruction, it stands to be true that Saddam violated 19 different resolutions of the Security Council. How will the United Nations ever remain relevant if it doesn't stand up to these resolutions?
The reason the United Nations exists is because it's a community of people who've decided to come together to hold the peace and to promote that in the world. The United States of America's job was to make sure that coalition of that organization were able to do that together. The United States didn't do that. It moved, and it shouldn't have.
Bonnie, I really think that's unfair. You know, the United Nations came together in theory to act against threats to the peace. The Soviet Union was a member of the Security Council and had a veto. The Soviet Union was not at all interested in stopping some threats to the peace. So you could never get unanimity, with the one exception of the occasion on which
I didn't say unanimity, Richard.
But in the UN system, Bonnie, you have to have unanimity in order to take Security Council action.
Richard Perle, am I right in thinking that you subsequently said that the war was illegal, that it was outside international law, but nevertheless the action had to be taken, it didn't matter?
No, I know the quotation you're referring to, and it's not accurate.
Okay, what's the accurate quotation?
Well, the lawyers argued about whether an additional United Nations resolution was necessary or not. Yeah. Some believed it was not. I share the view that it was not necessary to have yet another resolution, and Tony Blair, who I think led this country magnificently in that period, you should be grateful for his leadership.
We're not.
I think Tony Blair wanted another UN resolution. I think that was a terrible tactical mistake because we really didn't need it.
Okay. Yes, sir.
We talk about weapons of mass destruction, but who armed Saddam with the weapons of mass destruction? It was the United States.
No, not
Britain.
Okay, and the gentleman up there at the back, then I come to you in the middle. Yes.
I think Mr. Perle's contradicting himself. On one hand, he's talking about a measured approach, the fact that we made this list of countries that had WMDs. Wasn't this about one thing and one thing only, regime change?